What if I told you that the most powerful weapon in modern celebrity culture isn't money, influence, or even the press? It's rumor. Not proof. Not evidence. Just repetition. A whisper that turns into a headline. A headline that turns into a thumbnail. A thumbnail that turns into a belief. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And once people believe something, even if it started as nothing more than speculation, good luck ever erasing it. Ask yourself this. Why do certain stories refuse to die? Why do some names get dragged into controversy again and again, even when years pass, even when circumstances change, even when the facts never seem to fully land? And more importantly, why do we keep clicking? Tonight, we're not just talking about one woman, one marriage, or one rumor. We're talking about how scandal is manufactured, monetized, and weaponized in the age of viral outrage. Because when you strip away the shock titles and explosive claims, what you're left with is something far more unsettling. A system that rewards humiliation. A culture that confuses repetition with truth. And an audience, yes, including us, that keeps the machine alive. This story matters now because we are living in a moment where character assassination travels faster than facts. Where context is optional, where denial is treated as guilt, and where silence becomes a blank canvas onto which the internet paints whatever it wants. Scroll through any platform and you'll see it. Reaction videos reacting to reaction videos. Comment sections filled with certainty, even when no one can agree on what actually happened. Creators escalating claims because yesterday's shock isn't shocking enough today. And somewhere in the middle of that storm is a familiar pattern. A woman rises. The backlash follows. And suddenly, her past becomes the battlefield. Not her work, not her achievements, not even her verified actions. Her past. And the more intimate the accusation, the more viral it becomes. Why is that? Why does sexual rumor, in particular, ignite such intense fascination? Why does the internet treat private history like public property? And why are former partners so often dragged into narratives they never asked to be part of? This is where things get uncomfortable. Because the internet doesn't just consume stories. It reshapes them. A vague claim becomes a precise allegation. A source says becomes everyone knows. And before you realize it, speculation has been upgraded to certainty, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Think about the last scandal you followed. Did you ever stop to ask where it started? Who benefited? Who lost control of the narrative? Or did you just keep watching, waiting for the next reveal, the next twist, the next supposed bombshell? Here's the part nobody likes to admit. Outrage is addictive. It makes us feel informed. It makes us feel morally superior. It gives us something to react to, something to judge, something to dissect. And creators know this. They know that subtlety doesn't trend. They know that restraint doesn't pay. They know that if you push the claim just a little further than the last person did, you win the click. That's how the rumor economy works. But there's another layer to this story, one that rarely gets explored. The role of silence. Because when someone doesn't respond to a rumor, the internet fills the gap. Silence becomes suspicious. Privacy becomes evidence. And restraint gets rebranded as weakness. But what if silence isn't guilt? What if it's strategy? What if responding only pours gasoline on a fire that was designed to burn no matter what? And what about the people pulled into these stories by association? Ex-husbands, former friends, people whose names become anchors for speculation, not because they've spoken, but because their proximity gives the rumor a sense of legitimacy. It's a subtle trick. If a story includes a recognizable name, it feels more real, even if that name never confirms anything, even if that person never participates. Even if the connection is purely circumstantial. And once that association is made, it sticks. Forever. This is how narratives harden. This is how reputations become frozen in time, locked to moments that may not reflect the full truth, or any truth at all. And this is where the audience comes back into the picture. Because every view rewards escalation. Every comment boosts visibility. Every share tells the algorithm, more of this, please. So the claims get louder. The language gets harsher, and the humanity of the person at the center slowly disappears. They become a character, a villain, a punchline, not a person. Ask yourself something honestly. If your worst rumor followed you forever, would you survive it? If your private life were dissected by strangers who didn't know you, didn't like you, and didn't care whether the story was fair, would you even recognize yourself in the version they created? That's why this isn't just about celebrity culture. It's about power. Who gets to define the story? Who gets the benefit of doubt? And who becomes disposable entertainment? Because history shows us this pattern over and over again. Women are scrutinized more harshly. Their sexuality is moralized. Their ambition is reframed as manipulation. And their silence is treated as confirmation. And once the narrative sets in, even facts struggle to compete. Corrections don't trend. Context doesn't go viral. And retractions are boring compared to scandal. So the story continues. Not because it's proven, not because it's accurate, but because it's profitable. And the most dangerous part? The internet never forgets, but it rarely remembers correctly. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth at the center of this entire conversation. The real scandal isn't always what's being claimed. It's how easily we accept it. And once you start pulling at that thread, once you really examine how these stories are built, spread, and sustained, something else becomes clear. This wasn't an accident. And what comes next will force you to rethink not just this story, but your role in every scandal you've ever watched unfold. Because the moment you see how the machine works, you can't unsee it. Ask direct questions to the audience. What if the story you're absolutely convinced is true never actually started as a fact? What if it began as a shrug? A joke? A comment typed late at night by someone who never expected it to travel farther than a handful of strangers? And what if, by the time it reached you, it had already passed through so many hands that it no longer resembled its original form at all? This is where every modern scandal really begins. Not in a courtroom, not with documents, not with proof, but with a spark. Sometimes it's a blind item. Sometimes it's a friend of a friend. Sometimes it's a vague sentence designed to sound confident without actually saying anything specific. The genius of the rumor machine is that it never announces itself. It doesn't say, "This might not be true." It says, "People are talking." And that subtle shift makes all the difference. Because once people are talking, the story feels alive. Once it feels alive, it demands attention. And once it has attention, it begins to evolve. Here's the first uncomfortable truth. Most viral celebrity rumors don't start with intent to destroy. They start with curiosity. Someone notices a pattern. Someone connects dots that may or may not belong together. Someone asks a question that feels harmless in isolation. But curiosity doesn't stay neutral for long. Curiosity wants resolution. It wants answers. And if answers aren't available, the internet will invent them. Ask yourself this. How many times have you read a headline that said "sources say," and never once asked who those sources actually were? How many times have you accepted "allegedly" as a shield that magically turns speculation into something safe to repeat? Because that word is powerful. Allegedly. It gives permission. It removes responsibility. It allows people to say almost anything without owning it. And once that permission exists, escalation is inevitable. A vague claim becomes more detailed with each retelling. A hypothetical turns into a timeline. A suggestion becomes a scenario. And suddenly, you're no longer dealing with a rumor. You're dealing with a story. Stories are sticky. Facts are not. Stories have characters. Facts have footnotes. Stories create emotion. Facts require patience. So which one do you think travels faster? This is why the early stage of a rumor is the most important and the most dangerous. Because it's the moment where the narrative is still flexible, still malleable, still capable of becoming something else. But it rarely does. Because the internet doesn't reward restraint. It rewards confidence. Even false confidence. In fact, especially false confidence. The person who says, "I'm not sure," gets ignored. The person who says, "Here's what really happened," gets amplified, even when they have no more information than anyone else. And here's where contradiction enters the picture. The more outrageous a claim is, the more attention it receives. But the more outrageous it is, the less likely it is to be verified. So the stories that spread fastest are often the ones least grounded in reality. That doesn't stop them. It fuels them. Because disbelief doesn't kill a rumor. It feeds it. People don't click because they're sure it's true. They click because they want to see how bad it gets. And that's where the transformation begins. A comment becomes a clip. A clip becomes a compilation. A compilation becomes a deep dive. And suddenly, Creators are speaking with authority about events they never witnessed, people they've never met, and conversations that may never have happened. But they don't need access. They have an audience. And the audience wants certainty. This is the part that's hard to swallow. Most viewers don't actually want the truth. They want coherence. They want a story that makes sense, even if it's wrong. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable. It leaves questions unanswered. It leaves tension unresolved. A clean narrative, even a false one, feels better than ambiguity. So when a rumor offers a simple explanation for complex human behavior, it spreads. When it assigns motive, it spreads faster. When it includes intimacy, scandal, or shame, it explodes. And once it explodes, it's almost impossible to contain. Now think about this. At what point does repetition start to feel like confirmation? 5 people say something. You're skeptical. 50 people say it. You're curious. 500 people say it. You assume there must be something there. That's social proof. And social proof doesn't care about evidence. It cares about volume. The internet has mastered this. By the time a rumor reaches mainstream consciousness, it feels old. It feels established. It feels like background knowledge. People say things like, well, everyone knows. But nobody can tell you who everyone is. This is how belief forms without facts. And this is where responsibility begins to dissolve. Because once a story is everywhere, no single person feels accountable for spreading it. They're just repeating what they heard. They're just reacting. They're just asking questions. But questions can be weapons too, especially when they're framed to suggest an answer without ever stating it outright. Have you noticed how often scandals are built on implication? Not statements. Implication. What does it say that? Isn't it interesting that? Why would someone? These aren't accusations. They're invitations. Invitations for the audience to fill in the blanks. And audiences are very good at that. They project. They assume. They connect dots based on their own biases and expectations. And once those assumptions take hold, challenging them feels like an attack. People don't defend rumors because they're true. They defend them because they've invested emotionally. They've commented. They've argued. They've taken sides. Admitting the story might be flawed feels like admitting they were wrong. So instead, they double down. And that's when the narrative hardens. Now here's the twist most people miss. The originator of a rumor often loses control almost immediately. Once it's out there, it belongs to everyone. Other creators reinterpret it, add context, claim insider knowledge, and each iteration moves further from the source, like a game of telephone played at internet speed. Except this version never ends, and no one corrects the record, because correction doesn't perform. Drama performs, certainty performs, outrage performs best of all. So the rumor becomes less about what happened and more about what it represents. It becomes symbolic, a stand-in for larger frustrations, resentments, and cultural tensions. People stop arguing about the facts. They argue about what the person symbolizes to them. And that's when truth becomes irrelevant. This is how a single narrative can survive for years, even decades, even in the face of contradiction. Because it's no longer just a story. It's a belief system. And belief systems don't respond well to evidence. They respond to emotion. This is why early framing matters so much. The first version of a story sets the tone for every version that follows. If it's framed as scandal, everything that comes after is interpreted through that lens. Neutral actions become suspicious. Silence becomes strategic. Normal human behavior becomes coded. And anyone associated with the story becomes part of the mythology, whether they asked for it or not. This is where familiar names start to appear. Not because they've spoken, not because they've accused, but because proximity gives the story weight. An ex, a former colleague, a past connection. The internet loves anchors. Names that make speculation feel grounded, even when those names remain silent. Even when they never confirm anything. Their existence alone becomes part of the narrative. And that's when the rumor stops being just gossip. It becomes something else. A framework. A lens through which every future action is judged. And once that lens is in place, it's almost impossible to remove. Which brings us to the next stage. Because once a rumor has momentum, it doesn't just spread outward. It digs inward. Into motives. Into character. Into morality. And that's where things get personal. That's where speculation turns into character judgment. And that's where the real damage begins. Because the next step in the rumor life cycle isn't just belief. It's justification. People start asking not, did this happen, but what does this say about them? And when that shift occurs, the story no longer needs proof. It has purpose. And the moment a rumor has purpose, it becomes unstoppable. But here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. Who benefits from this? Because someone always does. Why does every scandal seem to circle back to one familiar figure from the past? Why, when a rumor needs weight, does it reach backward instead of forward? And why do former partners, especially ex-husbands, become permanent fixtures in stories they never agreed to tell? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Because silence has gravity, and the past is easy to manipulate. Once a rumor gains momentum, it needs something solid to cling to, something that makes it feel grounded instead of floating. That's where former partners come in. They're real. They're verifiable. They existed. And in the world of online speculation, existence is often mistaken for endorsement. This is where the narrative quietly shifts. The story stops being about what can be proven and starts becoming about what feels plausible. An X becomes a symbol, a reference point, a stand-in for credibility, even if that person never speaks. Especially if that person never speaks. Because silence creates space, and the internet hates empty space. Ask yourself this. When you hear that a former partner hasn't denied a rumor, what do you assume? Do you assume they're respecting privacy? Or do you assume there's something they're hiding? That assumption is the trap. Because most people don't understand what silence actually means in high-profile situations. Silence doesn't mean agreement. Silence doesn't mean confirmation. Often, silence means lawyers. It means contracts. It means non-disclosure agreements that don't just cover secrets, but entire chapters of a shared life. It means understanding that saying anything, even to deny, can reignite a fire that's already burning. But the internet doesn't operate on legal logic. It operates on emotional logic. And emotionally, silence feels suspicious. Especially when a rumor is already framed as scandal. This is how former partners become narrative anchors. They don't have to say a word. Their presence alone suggests depth. It suggests history. It suggests access. And once that suggestion exists, the audience fills in the rest. Think about how often you've seen this pattern. A headline references an ex. A thumbnail includes their photo. A creator says, "He hasn't spoken publicly about this." That sentence is doing more work than it appears. It's not informational. It's provocative. It implies that there's something to say. An implication is the lifeblood of scandal. The contradiction here is fascinating. If a former partner speaks, they're accused of bitterness. If they stay silent, they're accused of complicity. There's no winning position. So most choose silence. And that silence gets weaponized. Because the rumor machine thrives on imbalance. It thrives when one side is loud and the other is quiet. Not because quiet equals guilt, but because quiet allows others to control the story. This is where the past becomes a canvas. People project their assumptions onto it. They reinterpret old interviews, old photos, old timelines. Things that once seemed normal are suddenly framed as clues. A look becomes a sign. A quote becomes a confession. A moment becomes evidence. And because the past can't speak for itself, it gets rewritten. This is especially powerful when the relationship ended long before the scandal began. Distance creates mystery, and mystery invites imagination. The further back the relationship is, the harder it is to verify details. Memories fade. Records disappear. Context dissolves. But the internet doesn't care. It prefers a story that feels complete over one that's accurate. And a former partner offers the illusion of completeness. They make the narrative feel anchored in reality. Even when the connection is superficial. Even when the story being told doesn't reflect what actually happened. Now let's talk about motive. Why does the audience want X's involved? Because conflict sells. And nothing feels more emotionally charged than someone who knows the real version. The X becomes the imagined truth teller. The person who saw behind the curtain. Whether or not that's true doesn't matter. What matters is that it feels believable. And belief is enough. Creators understand this instinctively. They frame former partners as keys. Keys to secrets. Keys to the past. Keys to what really happened. Even if those keys never unlock anything. The mere suggestion that they could is enough to keep viewers watching. And here's where things get darker. Once a former partner is positioned as a potential source of truth, their silence becomes interpreted. This is how rumors gain emotional depth without gaining evidence. They accumulate meaning, layer by layer, until the audience feels like they understand the situation, even if they've never seen a single verified fact. And once that feeling exists, it's hard to challenge. Because you're no longer arguing with information. You're arguing with intuition, with belief, with a story that feels true. Now consider the pressure on the former partner. If they speak, they risk being accused of exploitation. If they don't, they're framed as passive confirmation. And if they legally can't speak, they're trapped. The public doesn't see the contracts, the legal advice, the potential consequences. They see a void, and voids get filled, usually with speculation. And speculation rarely favors restraint. This is why exes become permanent fixtures in narratives they never authored. They're useful, not to the truth, but to the story. They provide continuity. They link the past to the present. They make the rumor feel like part of a longer arc rather than a sudden attack. And longer arcs feel more legitimate. Ask yourself this. Have you ever watched a video where the creator spends more time discussing what someone didn't say than what they did? That's not accidental. Absence is powerful, especially when framed correctly. A creator doesn't need a quote. They need a pause. They need a raised eyebrow. They need to say, make of that what you will. And the audience will, eagerly, because interpretation feels participatory. It makes viewers feel involved, like they're uncovering something themselves. And that feeling is intoxicating. But here's the contradiction most people miss. If a former partner truly had explosive information, revealing it would almost certainly backfire. It would invite scrutiny, legal consequences, public backlash. Silence, in many cases, is the least dramatic option. But the internet doesn't reward least dramatic. It rewards escalation. So silence gets reframed as tension, as a ticking clock, as a promise of future revelation. People say things like, just wait. One day he'll speak. And that imagined future confession keeps the rumor alive indefinitely. It never resolves. It just lingers. Now think about how this affects the person at the center of the story. They're not just dealing with accusations. They're dealing with a past that's constantly being reinterpreted by people who weren't there. They're dealing with former relationships being reduced to narrative tools. They're dealing with silence being used against them, not just their own, but others. And that's exhausting. Because no matter what they do, the story keeps moving. Even when nothing new happens. Even when no new information emerges. The rumor sustains itself. Through implication. Through repetition. Through association. And the audience plays a role in this too. Every time someone comments, why hasn't he said anything? They're reinforcing the idea that silence equals significance. They're demanding a performance, a confession, a denial, a reaction. But real life doesn't owe the internet closure. That's the tension at the heart of modern scandal culture. The audience wants resolution. The people involved want peace. And those two desires are rarely compatible, which leads us to the next escalation. Because once former partners are established as narrative anchors, the story doesn't stop there. It looks for patterns. It starts connecting dots that may not belong together. It reaches outward, toward professions, toward industries, toward stereotypes. And that's when rumor transforms into something even bigger, something that feels systemic. And in the next chapter, we're going to examine how certain themes, especially around sexuality and morality, get layered onto these stories to make them even more explosive. Because once the narrative shifts from what happened to what kind of person is she, the damage multiplies, and the story becomes almost impossible to unwind. Why is it that the fastest way to destroy a woman's reputation has almost nothing to do with what she's accomplished, and everything to do with who people think she slept with? Ask yourself that honestly. Why do stories about ambition struggle to trend, while stories about sex explode? Why does morality suddenly become a public sport the moment a woman's private life enters the conversation? And why does the tone shift so quickly from curiosity to condemnation? This is where rumors stop being random. This is where they become strategic. Because once a narrative attaches itself to sexuality, it gains a kind of emotional voltage that few other topics can match. Sex triggers judgment. Judgment triggers engagement. Engagement triggers amplification. It's a perfect storm. And it's not accidental. Here's the contradiction at the center of it all. We live in a culture that claims to be liberated, progressive, and sex positive. But when it comes to women, especially women who challenge traditional power structures, that tolerance collapses instantly. Sex becomes currency, and shame becomes the exchange rate. You've seen it happen. A woman is portrayed as calculating rather than ambitious, strategic rather than smart, manipulative rather than driven. And the easiest shortcut to that framing? Sexual rumor. Because once sexuality enters the story, everything else gets reinterpreted through that lens. Success becomes suspicious. Confidence becomes arrogance. Boundaries become deception. The audience stops asking, "What did she do?" and starts asking, "What kind of woman does that?" That shift is devastating. Because it's not about behavior anymore. It's about character. And character judgments are far harder to dislodge than factual claims. This is why sexual rumors are so effective. They don't need proof. They rely on implication. They tap into deep, cultural biases that have existed for centuries. The idea that a woman's worth is tied to her sexual behavior, that her ambition must have a hidden cost, that her success must have been earned in ways that don't involve talent or effort. And once that idea is planted, it spreads fast. Because it offers a simple explanation for complexity. It reassures people who feel threatened. It reinforces existing hierarchies. And it gives audiences permission to judge without self-reflection. Now compare this to how men are treated. When men are linked to multiple partners, the tone is often admiration. They're described as charismatic, desired, living freely. It's framed as evidence of status. But when women are linked to the same behavior, the framing flips. They're irresponsible, untrustworthy, morally questionable. It's not subtle. It's structural. And rumor culture exploits that imbalance ruthlessly. Because the double standard does the work for them. Creators don't have to explicitly condemn. They just have to imply. They let the audience do the judging. And audiences are very good at policing women's sexuality, especially when they feel entitled to access. This entitlement is key. Public figures are treated as public property. Their bodies, their relationships, their choices, all fair game. And once that assumption is accepted, boundaries vanish. Private behavior becomes content. Intimacy becomes evidence. And speculation becomes normalized. Here's something worth sitting with. Most people spreading sexual rumors don't believe they're being cruel. They believe they're being observant. They frame it as analysis, as pattern recognition, as connecting dots. But connecting dots isn't the same as understanding context. And context is almost always missing. Relationships are complex. People change. Choices are influenced by factors outsiders never see. But rumor culture doesn't want complexity. It wants clarity. It wants a villain. And sexuality provides an easy shortcut. This is where shame enters the picture. Shame is powerful because it's contagious. Once a woman is framed as shameful, association becomes dangerous. People distance themselves. Support becomes conditional. Empathy evaporates. Because nobody wants to be linked to someone the internet has decided is morally compromised. This creates isolation. And isolation makes defense harder. Because defending yourself against sexual rumor often backfires. If you deny it, you're accused of lying. If you ignore it, you're accused of hiding. If you contextualize it, you're accused of justifying. There's no clean response. So many choose silence. Which, as we've already seen, gets weaponized too. Now here's the part that often goes unnoticed. Sexual rumors don't just attack women. They also erase men's agency. Men are portrayed as passive recipients of female manipulation, as if they had no choice, no desire, no responsibility. This framing reinforces outdated ideas on both sides. Women as temptresses, men as victims. It's a narrative straight out of history, and yet it persists. Because it's convenient. It absolves men of accountability while vilifying women for ambition. And that dynamic plays very well online, especially in spaces where resentment already exists. Resentment toward success. Resentment toward visibility. Resentment toward women who don't stay in their assigned lanes. Sexual rumor becomes a way to put them back, to reduce complexity into something small and controllable, to turn a person into a cautionary tale. And the audience participates willingly. Because judgment feels like power. It makes people feel informed, superior, protected from similar scrutiny. But that protection is an illusion. Because the same mechanisms can turn on anyone. All it takes is attention. Now let's talk about escalation. Sexual rumors rarely stay vague. they evolve. They get more specific, more graphic, more shocking, not because new information emerges, but because shock tolerance increases. What sounded outrageous yesterday sounds tame today. So creators push further. They add numbers. They add professions. They add settings. Specificity gives the illusion of credibility. It makes the story feel researched, even when it's not. And the audience rewards that specificity with views. This is where things become especially dangerous, because specificity hardens belief. Once a rumor includes details, people stop questioning whether it's true and start debating what it means. They argue about morality instead of accuracy. And that's exactly where the rumor machine wants them. Because morality debates are endless. They never resolve. They generate infinite engagement. And while people argue, the original claim goes unexamined. It just sits there, assumed, accepted. This is how sexual rumor becomes permanent. Even if it's later disproven, even if it's challenged, even if it's quietly retracted, the impression remains. Because sexual shame sticks. It lingers. It colors perception long after the conversation moves on. And that's the real damage. Not the initial rumor, but the residue it leaves behind. Now ask yourself this. Why do people feel so comfortable consuming this content? Why does watching someone else's humiliation feel entertaining? Part of it is distance. It's easier to judge strangers, especially famous ones, especially those framed as powerful. It feels like punching up, even when it's not, even when the harm is real. Another part is distraction. Scandal gives people something to focus on, something to react to, something to bond over. Shared outrage creates community, even if that community is built on someone else's pain. And once that community forms, dissent becomes unwelcome. Anyone who questions the narrative is accused of defending bad behavior, of being naive, of being biased. Nuance gets shouted down, because nuance threatens the group identity. This is why sexual rumor is such an effective tool. It polarizes. It simplifies. It divides the world into believers and deniers. And once that division exists, there's no incentive to seek truth, only to defend your side. This is the point where the story becomes bigger than any individual. It becomes symbolic, a proxy for debates about power, gender, morality, and control. And the person at the center becomes almost irrelevant. They're no longer seen as a human being with complexity and contradiction. They're a symbol. And symbols don't get empathy. They get projected onto. This is where the double standard fully reveals itself. Men involved in similar rumors often recover quickly. Their careers continue. Their reputations remain intact. Women, on the other hand, carry the stain indefinitely. It follows them through interviews, through achievements, through entirely unrelated conversations. It becomes their footnote. And that's the goal. Not to prove anything, but to diminish, to reduce, to ensure that no matter how far they go, the shadow remains. Now here's the twist. The same culture that punishes women for sexual rumor consumes it obsessively. It creates demand, and demand creates supply. Creators respond to what performs. Audiences reward what shocks. And the cycle continues, round and round, until the rumor feels inevitable, unavoidable, like it was always there. But it wasn't. It was built, step by step, click by click, reaction by reaction. And once you see that, you start to notice something else. These stories don't emerge randomly. They emerge at moments of visibility, at moments of transition, at moments when attention is already focused. Sexual rumor isn't just about sex. It's about control, about redirecting narratives, about shifting attention from achievements to allegations. And once that shift happens, it's very hard to reverse. Which brings us to the next escalation. Because once sexuality and shame are embedded into a story, the rumor machine looks for amplification. It looks for new arenas, new symbols, new angles, and one of the most effective amplifiers of all, association with sports, power, and masculinity. Because nothing supercharges a rumor faster than combining sex with status. And in the next chapter, we're going to examine why certain professions, especially athletes, become such potent accelerants in scandal narratives, and how that association transforms speculation into something that feels undeniable. What happens when a rumor isn't shocking enough anymore? What happens when it needs to grow, not in truth, but in impact? It looks for power. It looks for status. And very often, It looks for athletes. Because athletes bring something to a rumor that almost nothing else does. Visibility, masculinity, numbers, team identity. And once those elements enter the story, the rumor doesn't just feel scandalous. It feels undeniable. Ask yourself this. Why does a story suddenly sound more real when it includes professional sports? Why do people stop asking whether something happened and start debating how bad it was? Because athletes carry cultural weight. They represent strength, desire, access, privilege. And when a rumor links someone to that world, it borrows all of that symbolism. Even if the connection is vague, even if it's unverified, even if it's entirely speculative, the association alone does the work. This is where rumor architecture becomes very deliberate. Once sexuality and shame are already embedded in the narrative, the next step is escalation. You don't escalate by repeating the same claim. You escalate by adding status, by widening the scope, by making the story feel bigger than one person. Athletes accomplish that instantly. They're public figures, but not usually trained in media warfare the way actors or politicians are. They're often silent, unavailable, protected by teams and contracts, which makes them perfect, because silence, once again, creates space, and space invites imagination. Now notice something subtle. Rumors involving athletes almost always emphasize quantity. Not one person, not a relationship, but multiples. Numbers turn speculation into spectacle. They introduce scale. They create shock. They imply pattern rather than incident. And pattern feels meaningful, even when it's invented. This is why team narratives are so potent. A team suggests system, access, repetition, opportunity. It turns a personal rumor into something that feels organized. And organized feels intentional, which triggers judgment. But here's the contradiction. Athletes are often the least specific element in these stories. Names aren't confirmed. Dates aren't verified. Circumstances are fuzzy. But the presence of the category, professional athlete, makes people stop questioning. Because the stereotype fills in the gaps. People assume lifestyle, assume behavior, assume access, and assumption replaces evidence. This is how rumor piggybacks on cultural shorthand. The audience doesn't need proof. They think they already know how that world works. Locker rooms, road trips, fame, fans. It's a familiar script. And familiar scripts are easy to believe, even when they don't apply. Now let's talk about masculinity. Athletes symbolize a specific version of it. Competitive, dominant, desired. When a rumor links a woman to that symbol, the story instantly shifts. It's no longer just about her. It becomes about power dynamics. People start asking loaded questions. Who was using whom? Who benefited? Who was in control? And those questions are rarely neutral. They're designed to provoke judgment. Because sexuality combined with masculine status triggers deep, often unconscious reactions. Resentment, envy, moral panic. It challenges narratives people hold about fairness, deservingness, and access. Why her? Why them? And that resentment needs an outlet. Rumor provides it. This is where audience psychology becomes impossible to ignore. People don't just consume these stories. They emotionally invest in them. They argue about them, defend them, attack anyone who questions them. Because the story isn't just gossip anymore. It's a proxy, a stand-in for larger feelings about inequality, privilege, and gender roles. Athletes intensify that dynamic. They're seen as having access others don't. Money, status, opportunity. Linking a woman to that access allows critics to frame her success as derivative, as borrowed, as illegitimate. It's a way of stripping agency, of reframing achievement as transaction. And that reframing is devastating. Because once success is framed as sexually mediated, everything else becomes suspect. Every opportunity gets questioned. Every advancement gets reinterpreted. Every relationship becomes transactional in the public imagination. This is why athlete-associated rumors stick. They provide a narrative shortcut. They explain success without acknowledging effort. They flatten complexity into something crude and judgmental. And they're incredibly effective. Now notice how these stories are told. Rarely directly, rarely with firm claims. Instead, through suggestion, through tone, through carefully chosen words. They were seen around, sources close to. It wouldn't be surprising if. These phrases are designed to feel informed without being accountable. They give the audience the thrill of insider knowledge without the burden of verification. And when athletes are involved, that thrill intensifies. Because people assume secrecy. They assume cover-ups. They assume power protects power. So the absence of confirmation becomes further proof. It's a closed loop. And the more it loops, the harder it is to break. Let's talk about virality. Stories involving athletes. Trav. This is how false equivalence works. Because something has happened before, it feels likely to happen again. Even when the circumstances are entirely different. Even when the individuals involved aren't comparable. Even when there's no evidence connecting the dots. The pattern does the convincing. And once that pattern is accepted, the story becomes self-sustaining. Creators reference each other. Videos cite videos. Posts quote posts. The original source disappears. Buried under layers of reaction. At that point, asking, "Where did this come from?" feels almost irrelevant. The story exists. That's enough. Now pause and ask yourself, have you ever gone looking for the original source of a rumor and realized there isn't one? Just a chain of references, each pointing to the other, like mirrors facing mirrors. That's not a bug. It's a feature. Because when no one owns the claim, no one is responsible for it. And responsibility dissolves, which allows the story to grow unchecked. This is why athlete-associated rumors often reach a point of no return. They expand too fast. They entangle too many identities. They trigger too many emotional reactions. By the time anyone tries to slow it down, it's already moved on. And the person at the center is left dealing with the aftermath, not just of one claim, but of an entire ecosystem built around it. Speculation layered on speculation. Judgment stacked on judgment. And that ecosystem doesn't disappear when attention shifts. It waits, dormant, ready to be revived the next time visibility spikes. This is why certain rumors resurface again and again. They're not tied to events. They're tied to identity. And identity-based rumors are incredibly resilient because they don't require new information. They just require attention, which brings us to the next phase of escalation. Once a rumor has sexuality, shame, status, and virality on its side, it becomes economically valuable. It becomes content, and content has incentives. Creators begin to compete, to differentiate, to go further, because yesterday's shock is today's baseline. And in the next chapter, we're going to look directly at how clickbait economics reward escalation, punish restraint, and turn speculation into a business model. Because once money enters the equation, truth becomes optional. And the story takes on a life of its own. What if the reason these rumors never stop isn't because people believe them, but because someone is making money every time they spread? That's the part almost nobody wants to talk about. Because once you follow the money, the story stops feeling chaotic. It starts feeling engineered. This is the moment where the rumor machine reveals its most uncomfortable truth. Outrage isn't just emotional. It's profitable. And in the attention economy, profit shapes behavior faster than ethics ever could. Here's the mini hook you need to sit with. If a creator knows that escalating a claim will earn more views than questioning it, what incentive do they have to slow down? The answer is simple. None. And once you understand that, everything else starts to make sense. Let's break it down. Modern platforms reward three things above all else. Watch time, engagement, retention, not accuracy, not balance, not fairness. If a video keeps people watching longer, it gets promoted. If it sparks comments, arguments, and reactions, it gets boosted. If it triggers emotional response, it spreads. Truth is optional. Emotion is mandatory. Now ask yourself something honestly. Which emotion performs best? Joy, hope, nuance, or outrage? Anger keeps people watching. Shock keeps them clicking. Disgust keeps them commenting. And rumor combines all three. That's why creators escalate. Not because they necessarily believe the claims, but because escalation works. A vague title underperforms. A precise, shocking title explodes. A careful analysis gets ignored. A dramatic accusation trends. So creators adapt. They learn quickly. They test thumbnails. They tweak language. They watch analytics. And the data teaches them one lesson over and over again. Push harder. This is where the economics of rumor become ruthless. Once a story starts performing, it creates pressure. Pressure to follow up. Pressure to outdo competitors. Pressure to maintain momentum. Because in the creator economy, relevance is fragile. Miss one cycle, and the algorithm moves on. So creators chase the story. They release updates, even when nothing has changed. They speculate to fill gaps. They recycle rumors with new framing. And with each iteration, the story gets more extreme. Not because new information emerges, but because attention demands novelty. This is how escalation becomes normalized. What sounded outrageous last week becomes background noise today. So creators add more. More detail, more certainty, more shock, and audiences reward it. They click, they watch, they share. The algorithm notices, and it promotes the content further. This creates a feedback loop. Outrage performs. Outrage gets rewarded. Outrage becomes the default. Now here's the contradiction. Most creators don't wake up intending to ruin someone's reputation. They start by reacting, by commenting, by asking questions. But the platform trains them. It shows them what works. And over time, survival replaces caution. When rent depends on views, ethics become flexible. When relevance depends on outrage, restraint feels like self-sabotage. This isn't about individual morality. It's about incentives. The system doesn't reward the truth-teller. It rewards the entertainer. And scandal is entertaining, especially when it involves sex, power, and shame. Now consider the audience's role. Viewers often say they hate clickbait. They complain about exaggeration. They accuse creators of lying. And then they click the next video anyway. Because curiosity overrides principle. People want to see how bad it gets. They want to know what others are saying. They want to feel informed. So they participate, even when they know better. This is where the economy becomes self-sustaining. Creators escalate because audiences reward it. Audiences reward it because creators escalate. And the platform profits from both. Advertising doesn't care why you're watching. It only cares that you are. So the system has no reason to intervene. In fact, it has every reason not to. Controversial content keeps people engaged longer. Longer engagement means more ads. More ads mean more revenue. So rumor becomes monetized at every level. Creators earn. Platforms earn. Advertisers benefit from captive attention. The only person who doesn't benefit? The subject of the rumor. They absorb the cost. Reputational damage. Emotional toll. Permanent digital footprint. But those costs don't show up in analytics. So they don't matter to the system. Now let's talk about escalation mechanics. Creators rarely jump straight to extreme claims. They build. They start with curiosity, then implication, then certainty. This gradual shift makes the audience comfortable. It feels like a natural progression. Like the creator is uncovering something step by step. But often, nothing new is being uncovered. The language is just changing. This is interesting becomes this is concerning. This raises questions becomes this proves. Allegedly, quietly disappears. And the audience barely notices. Because they've already invested. They've already watched previous videos. They trust the creator. Or at least feel familiar with them. That familiarity creates authority, even when none exists. Now add competition. Multiple creators covering the same story. Each one trying to differentiate. One adds a new angle. Another adds a stronger claim. Another hints at insider knowledge. The bar rises. Subtlety dies. Whoever goes furthest gets the most attention. And once someone crosses a line without consequences, others follow. Because nothing happened. No penalty. No demonetization. No backlash. Just views. This is how boundaries erode. And once eroded, they're hard to rebuild. Now consider the psychological effect on the audience. Repeated exposure creates normalization. What once seemed shocking becomes expected. People stop reacting emotionally. So creators push harder to evoke the same response. This is escalation fatigue. And it's dangerous. Because it drives claims further from reality. It encourages speculation disguised as certainty. And it trains audiences to accept increasingly extreme narratives. All without realizing how far they've drifted from the starting point. Now here's the part that's rarely acknowledged. Even creators who try to be responsible feel pressure. They see peers growing faster. They see outrage outperforming analysis. They see restraint being punished. And they face a choice. Stick to principles and stagnate. Or adapt and grow. Many adapt. Not because they're malicious, but because the system makes it feel necessary. This creates a culture where rumor isn't just tolerated. It's expected. Audiences come to creators for scandal. They demand it. They ask for it. They comment things like, "Why aren't you talking about this? Everyone else is covering it. Say what we're all thinking." Silence becomes suspicious. Caution becomes cowardice. And anyone who pushes back gets accused of protecting the subject. So even dissent is framed as bias. This is how the economy enforces conformity. Now let's talk about the illusion of accountability. Platforms claim to discourage misinformation. They issue policies. They remove content occasionally. But enforcement is inconsistent, often reactive, often too late. By the time something is flagged, it's already spread. The damage is done. And creators know this. They know that if content survives the first few days, it's likely safe. They know how to phrase things to avoid direct violation. They know how to imply without stating. That's not accidental. That's adaptation. The system encourages creators to walk the line, to say just enough, to provoke without being explicit. And rumor thrives in that gray area. Now pause and ask yourself, have you ever seen a retraction go as viral as the original claim? Probably not. Corrections don't perform. Apologies don't retain viewers. Clarifications don't spark debate. So they're rare. And when they happen, they're quiet, buried, overshadowed by the next scandal. This creates asymmetry. False claims spread widely. Corrections barely register. And the audience moves on with the impression intact. This is why rumor feels permanent. Because the system favors initial impact over long-term accuracy. Now think about how this shapes content over time. Creators build brands around outrage. Their audiences expect a certain tone, a certain posture, a certain level of aggression. And once that brand is established, changing it risks losing viewers. So escalation becomes baked in. It's not just about one story. It's about maintaining identity. And rumor is an easy identity to maintain. There's always another claim, another angle, another person to speculate about. The supply is endless. And as long as the audience clicks, the machine keeps running. This brings us to the most uncomfortable realization. The rumor machine doesn't need belief. It needs attention. You don't have to believe a story to spread it. You just have to engage. You can hate watch. You can criticize. You can mock. It all counts. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between support and opposition. It measures interaction, and interaction fuels reach. So even skepticism can contribute to spread. Even debunking can amplify. This is the trap. Once a rumor enters the ecosystem, it's almost impossible to starve. Because attention is currency, and everyone participates in the economy, whether they intend to or not. Which brings us to the next phase. Because when outrage becomes a business model, silence becomes risky. For creators, for platforms, for anyone whose relevance depends on engagement. And that pressure doesn't just affect content. It affects people. It pushes them to speak when they shouldn't, to speculate when they don't know, to escalate when restraint would be wiser. And in the next chapter, we're going to look at the cost of silence from the other side. Not the creators, but the people at the center of these storms. Because when rumor becomes an industry, choosing not to engage can feel like surrender. And yet, engaging can make things worse. That tension is where real damage happens. What if the smartest move in a scandal is also the one that looks the worst? What if saying nothing protects you legally, emotionally, and strategically, but destroys you publicly? This is the paradox at the heart of modern scandal culture. Silence can save you, and silence can ruin you, sometimes at the same time. Here's the mini hook you need to grapple with. In an ecosystem that rewards noise, what happens to people who refuse to perform? Because that's what the internet expects now. Performance. A response. A statement. An apology. A denial. Something. Anything. Silence feels like defiance. Or worse, admission. But that feeling is manufactured. It's not natural. It's trained. Let's unpack how we got here. In the past, silence was normal. Most people didn't respond to rumors. They let them burn out. They trusted time to do its work. And often it did. But the internet changed the timeline. Rumors no longer fade. They resurface. They get archived, indexed, and re-uploaded. Silence no longer allows stories to die. It allows them to hibernate, ready to be revived whenever attention returns. This is why silence feels riskier now than ever before. But here's the contradiction. Speaking often makes things worse. Because when you respond, you legitimize the narrative. You signal that it matters. You give the story a new headline. A new cycle, a new surge of attention, even a denial can amplify, especially when the accusation is vague. Because denying something unclear invites people to imagine specifics. It fills in gaps. It turns implication into imagery. That's why lawyers often advise silence. Not because it looks good, but because it limits damage. Or at least, it's supposed to. The problem is that public logic and legal logic don't align. The public thinks in narratives. The law thinks in consequences. And those two frameworks are constantly at odds. From a legal perspective, silence is caution. From a public perspective, silence is suspicious. The internet assumes that innocent people fight back. They forget that fighting back means entering a ring designed to exhaust you. Because the internet doesn't want resolution. It wants content. If you respond once, you'll be expected to respond again. And again. And again. Every clarification becomes another clip. Every explanation becomes another reaction video. Your words get taken out of context, reframed, edited, reinterpreted, and suddenly, you're not controlling the narrative. You're feeding it. This is why silence is often chosen. Not because it's ideal, but because everything else feels worse. Yet silence has its own cost. And that cost is narrative vacuum. When you don't speak, others do it for you. Creators speculate. Audiences assume. Comment sections fill with certainty. And the story evolves without your input. This is where the trap tightens. Because once the narrative solidifies, speaking later becomes harder. Why now? Why not earlier? What changed? Delayed responses get framed as calculated, as reactive, as insincere. So silence buys time, but it also accrues suspicion. Time becomes both shield and weapon. Now think about the asymmetry of power. Creators can post endlessly. Subjects cannot respond endlessly. Every response costs energy, credibility, and emotional resilience. Creators face no personal risk. They speculate. If they're wrong, they move on. The subject lives with the consequences. This imbalance is critical because it means the burden of restraint falls entirely on the person with the most to lose. That's not a fair fight. Now let's talk about audience expectations. Audiences believe they're owed answers. They confuse curiosity with entitlement. They think visibility equals access. If someone is famous, they assume they must explain themselves. But fame doesn't erase human boundaries. It just makes them easier to violate. This expectation creates pressure. Pressure to clarify. Pressure to defend. Pressure to be transparent in ways ordinary people are never asked to be. And when that pressure isn't met, frustration grows. Frustration turns into accusation. Accusation turns into belief. This is how silence gets reframed as arrogance, as avoidance, as manipulation. Even when it's none of those things. Here's another contradiction. People often say they want honesty, but they punish it. Honest answers are messy. They include nuance. They include uncertainty. They include contradictions. And the internet hates all of that. It wants clean narratives, heroes and villains, right and wrong. Honesty disrupts that structure. So when someone speaks honestly, they get attacked from all sides. They're accused of lying by critics, of oversharing by supporters, of changing the story, of making excuses. So honesty doesn't end the scandal. It multiplies it, which teaches others a lesson. Don't speak, but don't stay silent either. This double bind is brutal, and it's especially harsh for women, because silence in women is often interpreted differently. A silent man is dignified. A silent woman is hiding. A man who doesn't respond is strategic. A woman who doesn't respond is evasive. These assumptions aren't conscious, but they're pervasive. They shape interpretation, and they make silence a gendered risk. Now add the role of timing. If someone stays silent early, the narrative grows. If they speak later, they're accused of reacting to pressure. If they speak too early, they're accused of panicking. There's no perfect moment. The window is imaginary, and the rules change depending on who's judging. This is why silence feels like a trap. No matter what you do, someone will frame it negatively. So people choose the option that minimizes harm. Often, that's silence. At least silence doesn't create new material. At least it doesn't give the rumor fresh oxygen. But here's the part that's rarely acknowledged. Silence is not passive. It's active restraint. It's a decision not to escalate. A decision not to feed the machine. A decision to protect long-term stability over short-term approval. But the internet doesn't value long-term thinking. It values immediacy. So restraint looks like weakness, and weakness invites attack. This is where empathy breaks down. Audiences forget that responding to rumors isn't just about public perception. It's about mental health, legal exposure, family, children, future opportunities. A single statement can have consequences that last years. So silence isn't cowardice. It's caution, but caution doesn't trend. Now think about how silence is used rhetorically. Creators say things like, "She hasn't denied it. He hasn't addressed the rumors. They're refusing to comment." These phrases aren't neutral. They're accusatory. They frame silence as a choice to withhold truth, not as a boundary, not as self-protection, but as avoidance. And once that framing sticks, it's hard to undo, because denial becomes expected. And when expectations aren't met, suspicion grows.